Today we're going to learn about cellular respiration, which is the process organisms use to obtain their energy. The purpose of cellular respiration is to harvest electrons from carbon compounds such as glucose and turn it into ATP. And remember, ATP is that molecule that stores energy that can then be used for our cells to do whatever process those cells need to do. So in other words, cellular respiration takes energy from our food and releases it into energy that can be used by our cells, which is the ATP energy. Now on this slide, I have the diagram of cellular respiration. You don't have to worry about copying this diagram yet. We will copy it down in about 2 more slides. So who does cellular respiration? Everything. So autotrophs and heterotrophs both do cellular respiration. Remember, autotrophs are our self-feeders. They are the organisms capable of making their own food. And then heterotrophs are the ones that cannot make their own food like us, and you have to consume your energy instead. All right, so here's the overall reaction for cellular respiration. So we have C6H12O6 plus 6O2 yields 6CO2 plus 6H2O. So what this equation is saying is we have glucose plus oxygen yield carbon dioxide and water. So make sure you take the time to write this down in your notes. You want both the chemical equation and the word equation. The numbers in the chemical equation should be subscripts. The formatting on this slide didn't convert them to subscripts, but it should look like C6H12O6 plus 6O2 yields 6CO2. And 6H2O. Okay, so make sure you copy both the chemical equation and the word equation. Also, in addition to just making carbon dioxide and water, we also get a bunch of ATP, which is going to store all of the energy that your cells need. So go ahead and add that in the equation. Again, just some vocab reminders. So anything to the left of the arrow, these are called our reactants. Okay, these are what go into the equation. Anything to the right of the arrow, these are called our products. Okay, these are what are made through the chemical reaction. And if you're looking at this equation and thinking it looks kind of familiar, you are correct. So this equation should look very similar to the photosynthesis equation, except it's flip-flopped, right? So in photosynthesis, glucose and oxygen were the products and carbon dioxide were the reactants. So in cellular respiration, it's the opposite. So this time we are taking glucose and oxygen and we're going to break them down and produce carbon dioxide and water and a whole bunch of ATP. So when we look at cellular respiration today, we're going to break it down into 2 main parts. The first part is called glycolysis. This is anaerobic, which means oxygen is not required in this step. Okay, so no oxygen. The second part, we're going to label it as aerobic, which means it needs oxygen. And we're going to break this aerobic part into 2 smaller steps. We're going to call it the Krebs Cycle and the Electron transport chain. All right, so the first step is called glycolysis. Glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm of a cell. So make sure you have cytoplasm in your notes for location. And what happens during glycolysis is that we take the 6-carbon glucose and we break it down into 2 molecules called pyruvate. And those molecules, the pyruvate, it's made of 3 carbons. Okay, so into 2 3-carbon molecules called pyruvate. A little fun fact, This process is ancient, okay? So it has been around for as long as we know it. All organisms, from the simplest of bacteria all the way to humans, perform this process the exact same way. And so during this process, we get 2 ATP molecules for every 1 glucose, and we get 2 NADH molecules for every glucose. And NADH, it's just another molecule that carries energy, and it's also going to carry electrons, which we'll see coming up in the next couple of slides. So for this slide, if you want, instead of writing all these words, you can just copy this diagram that I'm going to draw here. So in glycolysis, we take glucose and we break it down into pyruvate. And through this process, we also get 2 ATP molecules and we get 2 NADH molecules. Okay. So if this diagram is simpler to help you remember what happens, feel free to copy this down, and then this is how we know we start with glucose. We're producing pyruvate, and along the way we're getting 2 ATP and 2 NADH. So now I want to take a closer look at glycolysis. So here's a diagram to help us understand what's going to happen. So we start with glucose, which is our 6-carbon compound. In order for glycolysis to happen, we need energy. So that energy comes from ATP. And so the ATP loses a phosphate group from each, and those phosphates are going to join with the glucose. So when that happens, since the ATP is losing a phosphate, it changes to ADP, and then those added phosphates are going to cause the glucose molecule to split. And now we get 2 3-carbon compounds called G3P. All right, from here, it gets a little bit more complicated. But after the G3P is formed, 2 phosphates are going to be added, as well as electrons and hydrogen ions, which you can call protons. And they're going to combine with the NAD+, and they're going to form NADH molecules. These molecules are going to be used to carry electrons. And then finally, the G3P molecules are going to be converted to pyruvate. And when this happens, the 2 ADPs are going to be converted to 2 ATPs each. So then 4 molecules of ATP are going to be produced. All right, so I know glycolysis is complicated. And again, we don't have to be experts. We just have to know the big idea. So again, we just need to know that glucose is eventually going to make pyruvate. And along the way, we get 2 ATPs produced, and that's a net 2. Okay. And we get 2 NADH molecules produced. All right, so here's another diagram just to represent what's happening. So here we are inside the cell. So here's the mitochondria. This is the cytoplasm. So just a reminder, glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm outside of the mitochondria. Okay, so just another diagram. So glucose is going to make pyruvate, and we're going to get some ATP as a byproduct. All right, our next part of cellular respiration is the aerobic cellular respiration. So aerobic means oxygen is required. So there are 2 aerobic reactions, and these are going to occur in the mitochondria of the cell. Okay? And so our 2 aerobic reactions are going to be the Krebs cycle and then the electron transport chain. All right, step 2 of cellular respiration is called the Krebs cycle. It has some other names, so it can also be known as the tricarboxylic acid cycle, or TCA for short, or the citric acid cycle. Any of those names are fine. Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle are probably the two most popular names for this stage. And so just to remember, at the end of glycolysis, we are left with a net of 2 ATP molecules and 2 pyruvate molecules. And so in the presence of oxygen, this pyruvate is going to be transported to the mitochondrial matrix, and it's eventually going to be converted into carbon dioxide. And this happens in the Krebs cycle. Okay, so it's a series of reactions where pyruvate is going to be broken down, and it's going to be released as carbon dioxide. Now, also during this process, hydrogens and electrons are going to be taken from those pyruvate molecules, and they're going to be used to make NADH and FADH2, which are both molecules that carry energy, and they'll carry electrons. Also, in this stage, 2 more ATP molecules are produced. And then finally, these NADH and FADH molecules, they're going to carry energy to the last stage, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So here is a diagram representing the stages of the Krebs cycle. Now, we don't have to know all of these tiny little details, okay? This is very complex. We don't need to know all this. We really just need to know the big ideas, again, the big inputs and the big outputs. But I do want to go through the cycle just a little bit to give you a more in-depth understanding of what's happening. So at the end of glycolysis, we end with the pyruvate molecules. And so that pyruvate molecule, it's going to react with something called a coenzyme A. And it's going to form something called acetyl coenzyme A, or it can be called acetyl-CoA for short. So then this acetyl-CoA, it's going to combine with a 4-carbon compound, and it's going to end up forming something called citric acid. And then throughout the cycle, the citric acid is going to get broken down even further, and when this happens, it's going to release 2 molecules of carbon dioxide. It's going to generate 1 ATP. It's going to give off 3 NADH molecules and 1 FADH2 molecule. And then finally, at the end, the acetyl-CoA and citric acid are generated, and the cycle is going to keep on continuing. Okay, so instead of having to know this entire cycle, again, I'm just going to write a shorter version. So we have the pyruvate, and it's going to react with that coenzyme A. So it's going to make acetyl, and then CoA. And throughout the Krebs cycle, we're going to get 2 ATP, 6 carbon dioxide, 6 NADH, and 2 FADH molecules. Okay. So instead of having to know the entire Krebs cycle, we just need to know the big inputs and the big outputs. So we have pyruvate. It's going to react and become acetyl-CoA. And we're going to get 2 ATPs, 6 carbon dioxides, 6 NADH, and 2 FADH. One thing I want to point out is, remember, at the end of glycolysis, we had 2 pyruvates. So you really have to think of it as like 2 laps through the Krebs cycle. All right, going back to kind of our larger scale picture. So again, this is the inside of the cell. This is our cytoplasm, and here's our mitochondria. So glycolysis happens outside of the mitochondria, it happens in the cytoplasm. Okay. And then the citric acid cycle happens in the mitochondria. So in aerobic respiration, the electron transport chain is the final step in the breakdown of glucose. So the NADH and the FADH2 in the previous steps are going to give electrons to this chain-like series of steps. And as the electrons drop down the steps, energy is going to be released, and we're going to form a total of about 25 to 34 ATP. So in the perfect world, 34 ATP would be produced. However, we never ever produce the perfect amount. Okay, so you'll get a range somewhere between 25 and 34. And then at the very end of this, oxygen is going to combine with the hydrogen, and we also get 6 water molecules as just a waste product. So here's a diagram representing the electron transport chain. So the NADH and the FADH2 molecules, they're going to carry the electrons to something we call an electron carrier. And so the electrons are going to move through this electron carrier, and that is going to make something called a proton pump. So protons are going to be pumped through this channel, and they're going to move their way over to this enzyme called ATP synthase. So this is going to allow the extra phosphate to attach to ADP to create the ATP. Okay, so this is the big thing that's happening. So our protons are coming over here and allowing the phosphate to attach. So this is where the ATP is produced. Okay, so it's coming from ATP synthase. And then the electrons are just moving through the electron carrier. This is going to allow oxygen and hydrogen to bond back together to create water. All right, here's another diagram of the same electron transport chain. Okay, it's just a different artist. So again, we have the NADH molecule. FADH also does the same thing over here. So it's going to release the electrons. Okay. And when that happens, it's going to be converted to NAD+. Okay. For the FADH2, that one just gets converted to FAD. And then these protons, or the hydrogen ions, these are going to be released into the mitochondrial matrix. And these are just going to move across the inner membrane of the mitochondria, and they're going to just diffuse down this concentration gradient until they get to ATP synthase. And so this is what's needed to allow ADP to convert back to ATP. Okay. And then finally, it's not shown in this diagram, but oxygen is that final electron acceptor, and it allows oxygen to bond to the hydrogens and produce water. Okay, I can't play this animation because I'm in my recording software, but I will post this link to our webpage. And again, this is a nice simulation to show you what happens during that electron transport chain. All right. So here is the big picture of what's happening during cellular respiration. So our first step is glycolysis. So this happens in the cytoplasm. Electrons are just going to be carried from the NADH all the way over here to the electron transport chain. Then the pyruvate, that's going to move into the mitochondria, and it's going to go through the citric acid cycle. We're going to produce ATP during this process. And then electrons are going to be carried from the NADH and the FADH2 that are produced. And then they are going to go through the electron transport chain, which is where we're going to get the most ATP made. And remember, water is going to be one of our waste products made in this step as well. All right, so now let's just look at the net energy tally for one glucose molecule. So remember, if we just have one molecule of glucose during glycolysis, we get 2 ATP. During the Krebs cycle, we get 2 ATP. And then during electron transport, remember the perfect number is 34. The range typically is somewhere between 25 and 34. For my adding down here, I picked 32. So we're in that range. So 32 plus 2 gives us 36. Okay, so we get 36 ATP for just one glucose molecule. Up here, I picked 29. 29 is like the absolute lowest number. So if you only get 25 through electron transport, 25 plus 2 is 29. Okay, so you're going to get that range of 29 to really like 38 ATP during cellular aerobic respiration.